Abubakar, the king of the Mali Empire, finally achieves his lifelong dream of becoming a sailor.
Yeah!
He lets go of the throne of Mali and sets off on a dangerous adventure. He goes with a fleet of 2,000 ships across the Atlantic Ocean, accompanied not only by veteran sailors, but also his wife and 3 children. In a journey that will test his greatest resolve, the king encounters many challenges along the path. A mysterious current that seeks to drag everything to the bottom of the ocean. An island filled with betrayal and loss. And monstrous spirit guardians which do not permit any humans to see the secrets of the ocean. Will King Abubakar overcome these obstacles to achieve his dreams? And if so, what price will he have to pay? Watch on to discover more. And while at it, don't forget to subscribe to Timbuktu Tales.
The first few days at sea were calm. King Abubakar was overjoyed, even overwhelmed, by the fact that he had finally achieved his lifelong ambition. "My younger self," he said to himself, "would be very proud of this day." He dared not speak his thoughts out loud. Although he had stepped down as King of Mali, he was still the leader of the people who had gone with him on this voyage. And he knew, from years of experience leading men into battle, that the last thing people expected to see was their leader speaking to themselves. As sovereign, he was expected to maintain a calm demeanor at all times before his subjects. He couldn't show too many extremes of emotion on his face, so he kept all the excitement he had to himself, humming slowly to the melody that Siddiqui played on his kora as the boat bobbed away. It had been 14 days since they left shore. For days, no land was visible on either side of their boat, none to the east nor to the west, none in front or behind them. All around the 2,000 ships on this expedition were miles and miles of open sea. It was all laid out like an endless glass that reflected the sky. The sails were kept open as the ships moved further and further into the sea, the sight of land quickly becoming a distant memory in the minds of all who sailed. King Abubakar stood at the midsection of one of the larger boats in the fleet. A special housing had been built to accommodate not just the king, but also his wife, the 3 children who had come along for this journey, and Siddiqui, his advisor of many years. The housing, while nowhere as luxurious as the palace they left behind on land, was solid enough to shield them from the unrelenting glare of the sun during the day and the cold, cold nights. Abubakar stood at the edge of the wooden housing, right behind the captain's section, and looked into the horizon as he hummed to the tune played by Siddiqui. It was early in the morning. The sun was just creeping out of the bottom of the ocean. The winds were strong enough to keep the ships gliding smoothly. The ships were split into 20 groups of 100 each, with ships of all shapes and sizes in an orderly fashion. The lead ships were the strongest and the toughest, comprising some of the most experienced sailors. They are the ones which went ahead and formed the path along which the rest followed. These lead ships were followed by a series of supply ships. Most of them contained dried grains and meat, with a whole team of people who kept them in good order. Fresh water was also kept in massive leather bags hidden under canopies to keep them cool at all times. The crew and cargo ships moved in perfect lines that stretched as far as the eyes could see. The king's ship was in the 3rd column, shielded on all sides by others. While this arrangement was not what the king desired most, as it meant he could not have a full view of the seas ahead, it was a practical solution to ensure his safety. After all, no commander goes into battle on the front lines. The king had to be shielded. Even though the ships were going into a journey, they all knew this was a battle on its own, against an invisible enemy. It was barely a year since he had sent out more than 200 ships into the same sea. Yet only one had only returned. The very man who had come back with that ship, its captain, was now the one at the head of this ship. The captain and his crew had returned to Mali a shell of himself, having battled the sea for months to return to land, with the rest of the ships having disappeared into the distance. No one knew what their fate was. Did they make it to the land on the opposite side of the ocean? This is a question that occupied the king throughout the initial days of the journey, and then even this very moment. Even as he hummed to the kora tune, excited by finally being at sea, he was still worried at the fate of his first set of ships. He stood at the edge of the boat, lost in these thoughts. "Father!" a little voice called softly, waking the king from his trance. Abubakar looked down. It was Bala, his youngest son, his eyes wide with the endless wonder of the sea. A genuine smile, the first true one of the day, touched the king's lips. "Ooh, Bala. Good morning, little lion." He lifted the boy effortlessly, settling him against his chest. The boy relaxed and looked into the distance, in the opposite direction as the king. Father and son watched the ocean as the ships moved and moved into the ocean. They stayed in silence, watching the sun climb and the fleet glide. The child relaxed, a warm weight against his father's beaded tunic, and stared out at the waking world, his gaze fixed on the stern, on the endless road of churned water they had already traveled. The rhythmic creak of the ship, the sigh of the wind, the distant cry of a seabird was a lullaby of motion. Bala's head grew heavy on his father's shoulder, his eyelids beginning to droop, lulled by the steady beat of his father's heart. The boy was almost drifting back to sleep when the captain's voice pierced the morning air. "Danger! Danger! My king! To the west, a great darkness on the water. It comes for us." The king's head snapped up, his calmness evaporating like water in the midst of a desert heat. The peaceful ambience of a moment ago was replaced in an instant by the hardened focus of a general. He followed the captain's trembling finger, pointing past the starboard bow. There on the horizon stood the most terrifying of things his eyes had ever seen. Worse than the worst of his nightmares, where the perfect blue of the sky met the shimmering glass of the sea. A line of impenetrable black was forming. Their ship was quickly moving towards an immense wall of shadow that seemed to be sucking the light from the world, growing taller and wider even as he watched. The air, once filled with the friendly morning breeze, grew still and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The melody of the kora ceased abruptly. Siddiqui's hands fell still on the instrument's strings. The boy in the king's arms, startled awake, began to whimper softly. The calm seas were over. The previously serene fleet dissolved into a frenzy of controlled panic. The boy was screaming on Abubakar's shoulder, scared at the chaotic scenes playing all around him. Abubakar handed his frightened son to a waiting servant who appeared from the cabin, his wife's anxious face visible in the doorway. "Get inside, all of you, now." His voice was low, a command that brooked no argument. He turned his eyes into the horizon, his eyes fixed on the approaching darkness. Siddiqui and the old scholar of the seas were at his side in an instant. "What is it, scholar?" the king asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A storm, like the one the captain described." The old advisor squinted, his wise face etched with deep concern. "I have never seen it, like Mansa. It moves like a living thing. And look at the water." Abubakar tore his gaze from the terrifying sky and looked down. The sea around them was changing. The gentle, rhythmic swells were breaking into a confused chop. More alarming was the color. The clear, deep blue was shifting to a murky, greenish hue, and within it, he saw long, streaming tendrils of a darker current, like veins of ink pumping through the ocean's heart. A deep, low groan vibrated through the hull of the ship. a sound felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. It was the sound of a massive, moving force of water. The current, the scholar breathed, his usual composure finally cracking. The river in the ocean. He warned us of this. It grabs the hull and does not let go. The lead ships, the brave vanguard, were the first to meet it. Abubakar watched, his heart hammering against his ribs as the first canoe hit the edge of the dark water. Its forward momentum seemed to vanish. For a moment, the ships wallowed, confused. Then, as if a giant hand had seized their sides, they were wrenched sideways, turning violently in the unrelenting sea. The ships were no longer sailing. They were being dragged. One by one, the Pathfinder ships were snatched by the inexorable flow, their orderly line breaking into a scattered cluster of helpless toys. The current was moving faster now, a visible torrent within the calmer sea, pulling everything in its path towards the growing wall of blackness. Men cried like babies as they were tossed into the air like leaves in a storm, before plunging deep into the sea. Their cries were quickly silenced by the whirlpool that churned at the eye of the river in the ocean. Panic began to spread through the fleet like a fever. The shouts of captains trying to maintain order were swallowed by the growing roar of the wind that now whipped from the strange darkness. The air grew cold. "Can we turn back?" Abubakar yelled to the captain over the rising gale. The captain's face was ashen. Tumani shook his head, his eyes wide with the memory of his first ordeal. "There is no fighting it, Mansa. It is stronger than any wind, any paddle. It is the pull of the sea itself." Joliba's pride shuddered as the first outer tendrils of the current licked at its hull. The ship groaned in protest, its timbers straining. The world tilted. The king grabbed the rail to keep his feet, his knuckles white. He looked out at his armada, his life's ambition, his people. The neat columns were disintegrating, ships spinning, colliding in the churning water, their masts tilting at crazy angles against the horrifying backdrop of the advancing gloom. They were not sailors anymore. They were leaves in a gutter, being swept towards a drain they could not see. The battle was not against an invisible enemy anymore. The enemy was here, and it had them in its relentless, drowning grip. "It is all over before it even started," the king said, as his grand dream turned into a nightmare right in front of his eyes. The captain's face, a mask of traumatic memory, froze for a heart-stopping second. He was back in the nightmare, hearing the screams of his first crew swallowed by the abyss. For several minutes, Captain Tumani stood at the deck, unable to move, as if he had given up to his fate. His eyes, wide with the ghosts of past voyages, locked onto the current, a writhing, living thing that had haunted his nightmares since he'd last faced it years ago. The crew whispered of his survival, a tale of a man who'd wrestled the sea and lived. But the terror in his gaze betrayed the cost of that victory. For a heartbeat, the ship seemed to teeter on the edge of oblivion, the current's pull dragging at its hull like a predator toying with prey. The captain could not remove himself from the horrors he experienced in his last trip on the seas, and it was akin to a chain that held him firm to the hull, unable to make a single move. The crew shouted at him, "Captain! Captain! Captain!" But it was as if his ears had been plugged shut. He neither responded nor moved an inch. But then, the fierce roar of the wind and the terrified cry of a child snapped him back. He quickly came back to full realization that if there was anyone who could salvage the situation, it was him alone. This renewed awareness stirred him into action, and he instantly started issuing commands. "We are facing the belly of the ocean beast," the captain bellowed, his voice finding a power that overcame the fear that still gripped him. "It will swallow us if we fight it. Our only path is through. We must let it take us, but on our terms. Face the storm. Face it head on." The captain was in rapid motion, barking orders in a voice that cracked with urgency like a strong metal forged in the furnace of danger. "Stabilize the sails. Now, all hands secure the cargo. Lash everything down." Sailors scrambled up the rigging, their forms dark against the brightening sky, wrestling with the billowing canvas. On the decks below, others rushed to tie down pots, tools and weapons, the sharp reports of hammers securing hatches echoing across the suddenly silent water. His orders cut through the panic like a knife. "Lower the basket anchors." From the stern, "Now. All hands to the steering oars. Turn her into the wave." Chaos began to crystallize into desperate purpose. Massive woven grass baskets filled with dense stones, designed for this very terror, were hurled over the stern. The baskets plunged into the murky, churning water and immediately bit deep, acting as a drag to keep the ship's bow from being swung broadside to the crushing waves. Sailors and soldiers, their eyes wide with fear, threw their weight against the giant steering oars, muscles straining against the hydraulic vice of the current. The ship groaned, a beast in agony, its timbers protesting as it began a slow, arduous turn. King Abubakar did not hesitate. He shoved his son into the arms of Siddiqui. "To the cabin, keep him calm." The old advisor, his own face pale, nodded grimly and vanished below with the weeping boy. Then the king, the former Mansur of Mali, grabbed a free oar slot alongside a burly sailor. "For your families!" he roared, his voice a thunderclap. "For Mali!" Queen Candia, her robes soaked with spray, was beside him a moment later, her hands finding purchase on a rope, pulling with the strength of a lioness. There were no royals and subjects at that moment. There were only souls fighting for one more breath. All across the deck it was the same. The order echoed from ship to ship. "Basket anchors! Face the wave!" But not all could hear. Not all could react in time. And the sea was a mighty monster that swallowed all that came in its path. The sea was merciless, devouring ships with all their crew. The smaller, lighter vessels were the first to fail. A reed canoe, its sail still half open, was lifted by a monstrous swell, stood vertically on its end against the black sky, and was smashed back down into the ship, vanishing into a chaos of splinters and despair. The terrifying crack of wood against wood echoed as two supply ships, their steering lost, collided in the gloom. Another, hit on the side by a mighty wave, rolled over without a sound. Its crew spilled into the torrent like discarded seeds. Its wooden frames snapped like twigs, the crew's cries silenced by the roar of the massive river in the sea. Supplies vanished into the depths, barrels and crates torn free and lost. The king's fleet was being torn apart. Abubakar, heaving at his oar, saw it all in horrific flashes between sheets of stinging salt spray. Each lost ship was a dagger in his heart. This was his dream, and it was drowning. Yet at no point did the ship's captain let go of issuing commands and steering the ship, till they were fully immersed inside the massive current. They had crossed a threshold. The world changed. The violent screaming wind dropped away to an unnerving, suffocating whisper. The light faded from storm grey to a murky twilight green. They were inside it. The current held them now, pulling them forward with a silent, inexorable force. The waves were still massive, but they were rhythmic, predictable. The terrible noise was replaced by a ghostly symphony. The creak of the ship, the deep groan of the basket anchors dragging, the low howl of wind far above them, and the haunted cries of the lost echoing across the water. They were in the conduit of the sea god, being pulled to an unknown fate. For hours, which felt like an eternity, they drifted in this eerie half-world, surrounded by the shadows of other surviving ships, all locked in the same silent, desperate journey. Abubakar held his breath, worrying that the worst was yet to come. And then, the darkness began to lighten. The green hue softened to blue. The rhythmic waves began to diminish. The silent current's grip slowly, gradually, released them. As if passing through a veil, the king's ship emerged. The sudden, blinding sunlight was a physical shock. The roar was gone. The wind was now a gentle, warm breeze. They were rocking gently on a vast, calm, sun-drenched sea. It was as if they were in a brand new world, far away from the disaster that had struck them not too long ago. Silence descended, broken only by the lap of water against the hull and the ragged gasps of the exhausted survivors. People collapsed where they stood, trembling with adrenaline and relief. Abubakar and the Queen leaned against each other, their hands blistered by the rowing, their magnificent clothes in tatters, their bodies trembling with spent effort. The king raised his hands toward the skies, seeking the sun's warmth for palms that had been frozen by the cold current. He then looked around. Where there had been a mighty armada, now there were perhaps a few hundred ships, scattered like driftwood on the immense blue desert. The loss was catastrophic, but they were alive. The strongest ships, the supply vessels, many had survived. "We still have a chance," the king mumbled under his breath. The captain slumped against the helm, his face etched with relief and lingering dread. "Find land," he rasped, his voice hoarse from shouting. "An island, a shore, find it now or we're done." The rowers rested, their oars still, as the navigators scanned the horizon for any sign of hope. The mission was no longer conquest or discovery. It was survival. From the doorway of the cabin below, a sound drifted up. It was faint, but in the deafening quiet of this calm sea, it was as clear as a bell. It was the sound of a child's laughter. Then, the soft, familiar plucking of a kora. Siddiqui's voice, thin but steady, wove a funny tale about a mischievous monkey and a baobab tree. A story from home. The boy laughed a little more. Siddiqui played the kora a little more. The captain sailed on, as King Abubakar continued with his voyage. Weeks bled into one another on a sea that had traded its fury for a vast, monotonous indifference. The sun was their constant, brutal companion by day, and the cold, distant stars their only comfort by night. The once proud fleet was now a ghostly procession of battered hulls and patched sails, moving with a weary rhythm dictated by wind and current. Hope was a rationed commodity, dwindling like their fresh water and food. The supplies that had been so plentiful when they left Mali were now quickly running out, and even the king could barely have a proper meal. Although the silence of the sea was from time to time broken by the roaring and plunging of whales, which never ceased to amuse the king's young son, most of their journey was silent and lonely. They were all alone in a vast body of water that threatened to swallow them, if hunger and thirst did not take them first. Some sailors had already resigned to their fate, that finding land would be almost impossible. Some just lay on their ships and allowed the sails to drift them off. But Captain Tumani did not give up. Neither did King Abubakar, or the scholar whose star-reading skills helped them navigate the vast seas. Throughout the journey, he was on the lookout for any signs of land, always standing next to the captain, plotting the way forward. Then, on the 27th day since the current had spat them out, a cry came from the crow's nest of a scout ship, a sound so raw with disbelief it carried across the water. Land! 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 It was not the majestic continent of the king's dreams. It was a sliver of emerald against the endless blue, a volcanic peak shrouded in mist, fringed by a crescent of white sand and dense, dark jungle. But to the parched, sun-scorched survivors, it was paradise. They landed with a great joy bordering on tears. Men and women rushed from the ships and fell to their knees on the warm sand, kissing the ground, weeping with relief. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming flowers, and life. A profound change from the sterile salt of the open ocean. Freshwater streams, running down from the central highlands, were found within hours. It was a place of healing. For days, the camp hummed with grateful industry. Shelters were built from palm fronds. Hunting parties brought back strange, plump fowl and wild pig. The ships were repaired, and the remaining supplies, dwindled but critical, were carefully inventoried and stored in a central, guarded cache. King Abubakar, working alongside his people, felt a flicker of his old purpose. They would rest, recover their strength, and continue. The dream was wounded, but not dead. It was on the fifth evening that the silence of the jungle was broken. A hunting party returned to camp not with game, but with a group of haggard, wild-eyed men. Their skin was leathered by the sun, their clothes little more than rags, but the remnants of Malian patterns were still visible on the tattered cloth they wore. They were men from Mali, survivors from the first expedition. Their leader, a tall, heavily built sailor named Fodi, and whose arm bore a long, poorly healed scar, fell to his knees before the king, not in deference, but in utter exhaustion. There were 50 of them, he said, his voice a dry rasp. Out of 800, sire. The rest were swallowed by the sea, he added. Their ship had been wrecked on the far side of the island over a year ago. They had believed themselves the last men on earth, condemned to die on this forgotten shore. A feast was held that night. It was a somber celebration, a mingling of relief and shared trauma. The new arrivals ate with a desperate, frantic energy, their story tumbling out between mouthfuls. They spoke of the same terrible current, of a storm that shattered their fleet, of watching their companions drown. King Abubakar listened, his heart a stone of grief and guilt. These men were living proof of the fate he had sent so many to. But as the night wore on and their bellies were filled, the mood among the castaways shifted. The king spoke of his renewed mission, of the 2,000 ships that had become a few hundred, of his unwavering intent to press on, to cross the ocean. A dangerous silence fell over the group of survivors. Fodi stood up, his earlier respect for the king's authority gone, replaced by a hard, pragmatic defiance. "Press on," he echoed, his voice loud in the firelit circle. "You call this a mission, Mansa? We followed you once into that hell. We watched it consume our brothers. You would have us board those wooden coffins again and give ourselves back to the sea. This is not ambition. It is a madness that has already cost 1,000 lives." A murmur of agreement rose from his men. The king's own crew watched, tense and divided. "We have a duty to the empire," Abubakar began, his voice stern. "Our duty is to live," Fodi shot back. The king's guards stepped forward, unleashing their swords while their commander looked sternly at Fodi and declared, "How dare you?" The man stared at them, terror in his eyes. Before they could act further, Abubakar raised his hands and the guards stopped. "Let him speak," Abubakar declared. "This island is our empire now." Fodi continued with his defiant speech. "It has water, food and animals. It is a prison, but it is a living one. The sea is a grave. We will not go with you." The king looked at him for a long time, then declared, "I see what you mean. Let's talk more about this in the morning," and the matter was not raised any further. The night's feasting went on deep into the night. As Siddiqui and the other musicians played, the sailors shared stories from home, now many, many miles away. They spoke late into the night, till the fires started to flicker and all laid down to sleep. But Fodi and his men did not sleep. The castaways had not survived a year on the island by brute strength alone. They had learned its secrets, In the dead of night, they created a distraction deep in the tree line. A sudden, frantic crashing and the simulated roar of a predator. The guards who stood next to the king's compound, where the small remaining supplies of food remained, rushed out to check what was happening. As the guards' attention was pulled toward the sound, Fodi's men, who had been hiding in a stream bed that ran directly behind the compound, slipped silently from the water. They passed sacks of grain and supplies of dry meat through the loose rear fence, their movements masked by the noise of the stream and the distant commotion. It was not a raid. It was a theft conducted by ghosts. The alarm was raised too late. By the time the king's guard realized the distraction was a ruse, the mutineers had vanished back into the jungle, taking a devastating portion of their remaining supplies with them. A few of their men and women had also disappeared into the jungle with Fodi. "After them!" Abubakar commanded, his voice a whip-crack of fury. His teenage son, Modu, was at his side in an instant. Eager to prove his worth and enraged by this betrayal, Modu stated, "Father, let me help. I can track them." Before the king could stop him, he had drawn his short sword and joined the guards, sprinting into the dark, tangled undergrowth. The king, shouting orders to secure the camp, lost sight of him almost immediately. The queen rushed out shouting, "Where is Modu? Where is he?" No answer came as the camp descended into organized chaos, guards rushing into the forest, while others secured the few remaining supplies. The guards, accompanied by the impulsive teenager, pushed hard, following the obvious trail of trampled foliage. It was exactly what Fodi had anticipated. The trail led to a treacherous area of cast rock, riddled with crevices hidden by thick ferns. The prince, driven by anger, was at the front. As he rushed deep into the forest, running around a thick tree, his foot suddenly got caught on a vine. He stumbled forward with a cry, not onto solid ground, but into a sudden, terrifying emptiness. His cry was cut short by a damp, final thud far below. A moment later, two other bodies slumped on top of him as he lay bleeding. It was a trap. The remaining guards rushed to the edge. Their torches illuminated a deep, narrow sinkhole, a fissure in the volcanic rock, a hidden throat into the earth. They called his name, their voices echoing into a profound, silent darkness. "Prince Modu! Modu! My prince!" There was no answer. They called the names of the two others, but only a faint groan came forth. They lowered a man down on ropes, but he found only stagnant water and loose rock at the bottom. The boy was simply gone. The mutineers' trail, they realized, had been a deliberate lure into a trap. The commander immediately stopped their futile attempt to reach Fodi and his men. The mutineers had vanished into the impenetrable interior, and the king's heir had been swallowed by the island. The cost of the dream had become unbearable. Queen Candia, on learning of the tragedy, retreated into a silence as deep as the pit that had taken her son. The camp, once a place of hope, was shrouded in a pall of despair and mourning. For 3 months they remained. They had to. Their spirit was broken, and the rainy season arrived, making the sea impassable. They rebuilt their supplies, slowly, painfully, the work a mechanical distraction from their grief. The king aged a decade in those months, his face etched with lines of sorrow and responsibility. When the skies finally cleared, a census was taken of the surviving fleet. Of the glorious armada of 2,000 vessels that had left Mali, a mere 300 remained seaworthy. They were a fractured nation, a shadow on the water. Finally, on a morning when the seas were calm once more, Abubakar stood on the beach, looking at his much diminished fleet. There were no grand speeches, no talk of glory or empires. His eyes were not on the horizon, but on the jungle that had taken his son. "We go," he said to his captain, his voice hollow but resolved. "Those who remain loyal, we go. Not for ambition, not for glory, but because to turn back now would make their deaths, and his, mean nothing. We sail until we find an end to this water, or it finds an end to us. The ships were loaded in silence. As they pulled away from the shore, the island seemed to watch them go, a green monument to their greatest loss. And from deep within its interior, if one listened closely, the faint, defiant sound of a Malian drumbeat could perhaps be heard. Not a call to join them, but a permanent, bitter farewell. Watching from a cave hidden at a high peak on the island, Fodi and his men bid their king goodbye. "Forgive me, my king." Fodi whispered a silent prayer for the fleet as he watched the ships disappear into the sea. The sea, after the Island of Sorrows, became a merciful companion. For weeks they sailed under clear skies, the wind firm and steady at their backs. Seagulls flying high in the skies above kept them company. The deep, abyssal blue of the water had become a familiar sight, no longer a thing of terror but a pathway. The grief for their lost son was a quiet, shared wound between the king and the queen. Even more grieved was the princess, who could barely come to terms with the tragic loss of her dear brother. The routine of the sea and the unwavering purpose of the king provided a fragile structure to their existence. They sailed for weeks till the color of the sea started to change. The deep blue was swallowed by a greenish gray, and the waves, once long and rolling, became steep and choppy. The air grew thick and cold, carrying a strange, briny odor that none recognized. The captain's face, which had slowly relaxed its perpetual grimace, was once again etched with deep concern. "The water is confused here," he muttered to the king, who stood beside him at the rail. "The bottom rises sharply. It is as if the ocean floor has great mountains we cannot see. It makes the sea angry." It was more than anger. It was as if they had sailed into the territory of a sleeping god and woken it. The first attack was not seen, it was felt. A violent, shuddering gush of water impacted against the hull of Joliba's Pride, as if they had run aground on a submerged reef. But there were no reefs in this deep, dark water. A tentacle, thicker than the largest tree trunk in Mali, and of a vile, mottled grey-green, erupted from the churning water. It was covered in suckers the size of shields, each ring more terrifying than the next. The crew screamed in agonizing terror at the monstrous sight. The tentacles slammed down on the deck of one of the lead ships, crushing two sailors where they stood before coiling around the mainmast. The wood groaned, splintered, and with a deafening crack, snapped in two, taking the sail and its rigging down into the chaos of the sea. And then there were more. Monstrous heads, beaked and ancient, broke the surface of the waves, eyes like great luminous orbs of jet regarding the ships with an alien and hungry malice. The creatures had the heads of an eagle, yet they were not covered in feathers, but scales, which rolled down to the tentacled body of massive octopuses. Their tentacles, countless and relentless, became the storm itself. They plucked men from the decks, hurling them into the air or crushing them against the rails. They wrapped around smaller ships, constricting until the hulls imploded, dragging them and everyone aboard into the crushing depths. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The spears and arrows of the Mali warriors were pinpricks against the Leviathan's hide. The sea was a frothing maelstrom of thrashing limbs and dying screams. The king fought with the rage of a man who had lost everything but his will, his sword hacking uselessly at a tentacle that threatened to drag his daughter overboard. The king watched in horror as the old scholar, master of reading the stars, was lifted up high by the tentacles and pushed deep into the sea, not to be seen again. More men drowned and ships sank as the sea around them trembled with the terrible force of the monster beyond their wildest imaginations. They were being erased from the face of the ocean. Hope was not just dying, it was being devoured. It was Queen Candia who understood. She saw not monsters but guardians. Not a random attack, but a judgment. She had heard the stories from the coastal elders of her homeland, tales of Mami Wata, the great spirit of the deep, and her terrible, jealous power. This was her realm, and they were trespassers. Her face, which had been a mask of silent grief since the loss of her son, settled into a terrifying calm. She hugged her young daughter tightly, kissing her forehead. She then knelt and kissed her small boy, his eyes wide with a fear beyond his understanding. "What are we going to do, Mummy?" The small boy clutched onto her, but she remained silent and whispered to him, "It shall be well, my sweet boy," and silently handed him over to his elder sister. Mother and daughter looked at each other and nodded in silent understanding. The queen finally looked at her husband, her king. He was shouting her name, fighting his way toward her through the carnage, jumping over bodies of his men and slipping on the gooey yellow fluid that fell from the tentacles into the ships. His eyes were wild with a new, final terror. He was too far. With a look that held a universe of love, grief, and fierce determination, the queen climbed onto the shattered rail. She raised her arms to the heaving, monster-choked sky, her voice cutting through the bedlam not with a shout, but with a clear, resonant declaration of sacrifice. "Mami Wata, mother of the deep, I come to you in peace, my life for theirs. Let my people go." And before the king's grasping hand could find hers, she threw herself into the water, directly into the writhing net of tentacles. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The king's scream was the most terrible sound any had ever heard. Then, the sea stilled. The tentacles, which had been moments from dragging the king's own ship under, went limp. They slid from the decks with a sound like retreating thunder, slipping back into the suddenly calm waves. The monstrous heads sank beneath the surface, their glowing eyes vanishing into the deep. The waves gentled. The wind died down to a whisper. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of battle. The cost of their passage lay in the floating wreckage and the empty decks, and in the unbearable void where Queen Candia once stood. The rest of the journey was a somber funeral procession. There were no songs, no music from Siddiqui's Kora. The king retreated into a silence deeper than any before. He was a shell, his spirit given to the sea along with his wife. He spoke only when necessary, his eyes fixed on a horizon that no longer promised glory, only an end. It was his daughter who now held his hand. It was his small boy he carried on his shoulder. They were the vessels of his duty now, the only reasons to put one foot in front of the other. 7 weeks into the journey, when the lookout's call came, "Land! True land! Land!" It was met not with cheers, but with a profound, exhausted silence. They landed on a beach of white sand, backed by dense, unfamiliar foliage. The air smelled of strange flowers and rich earth. The king, flanked by his daughter and with his small son in his arms, was the first to step onto the shore. His bare feet touched the solid, unchanging earth. Captain and Siddiqui, the two pillars of his journey, stepped down behind him, followed by the ragged, weary survivors of a dream. King Abubakar II, Mansa of Mali, had crossed the ocean, but the fever had already taken hold in the last days at sea. A fire in the blood, born of exhaustion, grief, and untold hardship. He had hidden its severity, pushing through the delirium for this single moment. His body was failing, but his eyes burned with a fierce, final fire. The king staggered onto the beach and fell to his knees, but not from weakness. He dug his hands into the sand. Then, from within his tattered robe, he produced a small, sealed pouch. With trembling hands, he opened it and poured out a rich, dark soil from the banks of the Niger River, mingling the earth of Mali with the earth of this new world. He stood for a long time, just feeling the land beneath his feet. Then, his legs gave way. Siddiqui and the captain caught him, lowering him gently to the sand. His children clung to him, their faces streaked with tears. "We are here," he said, "to the spirits of this place, to the memory of his wife and son. We are here." He was burning up, his breaths coming in shallow rasps. He looked at the survivors, the sailors, the soldiers, the mothers holding children, and his voice, though raspy, carried across the beach. "We are the seeds of Mali," he croaked. "Plant us in this new soil. Let our story be the root of a new world." The king had survived the journey, but the fever refused to leave him. The fever broke his body, but not his resolve. For 3 days he directed the establishment of the first camp from a litter on the beach, his voice a weak but unwavering thread of command. He pointed out where to build the first shelter, where to find fresh water. On the third evening, as the sun set on this strange new world, he held a council with his daughter and young son, Siddiqui, and the captain in a dimly lit tent made of remaining sail. He looked at the captain and said, "Thank you, Tumani. Thank you for everything." The captain bowed his head in respect and left the chamber. The king looked at his daughter and whispered, "Fatu, my beloved, you are just as courageous and beautiful as your mother. I know my people shall be in good hands." A small tear trickled down the princess's eyes as she whimpered, "Little lion, you are here." The king looked at the boy and held him close. "Play us a song," he said. Outside, the ocean waves blew strong, punctuating the voices of the people busy establishing a new settlement. Siddiqui sat by his kora and started playing an old melody familiar to all of them. The king closed his eyes and was in an instant transported back home. He remembered his boyhood days, seated by the banks of the river, watching it flow. He remembered going to war alongside his late uncle King Salif, many, many years ago. He remembered his people, the people of Mali, whom he loved and missed dearly. He remembered his brother Musa, who now ruled the kingdom, seated on the golden pempi under the great baobab tree. Siddiqui played on. The king recalled the family he had left behind in Mali, his other wives and children, their laughter piercing the ocean separating them. He remembered the son he had lost on this treacherous journey. And at last he remembered his first wife, Queen Candia, who had sacrificed all to see them through the treacherous waters. A smile, the first true, unburdened smile since the calm seas of their first days, touched his cracked lips. He then opened his eyes. Bright with a final, clarifying light, they found Siddiqui's teary ones. He looked up at the wrinkled face of his oldest friend, his advisor, the man who recorded each aspect of his life in song and story, and who had followed him to the end of the world. "We made it, Siddiqui," he whispered, the words a soft sigh of triumph. "We made it." With the smile still on his face, Abubakar closed his eyes one final time, and his journey was complete.
Thanks for watching today's episode of Timbuktu Tales. Like, share and subscribe to watch more of such amazing tales from Africa. And hey, don't forget to hit that notification bell to always get updates on new episodes every week. Are there any stories you would like us to work on? Feel free to share your ideas in the comments section below.